One morning, as Frank watered his neatly trimmed lawn, he noticed a moving truck pulling up to the empty house next door. It was a small, cozy place with a white picket fence, and Frank knew it well. He'd even painted that fence once himself, just so it'd match the neighborhood. He squinted as he saw the muscular black man step out of the truck, carrying boxes from the back. "Well, what do we have here?" Frank muttered to himself, eyes narrowing as he watched the man stack the boxes on the porch. "A new neighbor, eh?" Frank kept watching. The new man's name was Theo Brown, and he was busy unloading his boxes with a focused look on his face. He didn't look like the usual Hillcrest folks, Frank thought to himself. Theo wore a plain black t-shirt and jeans, and his arms were strong, too strong, Frank decided, with a tattoo just visible beneath his sleeve. Frank wasn't one to trust tattoos. Theo caught Frank's gaze and gave him a friendly nod, but Frank just turned away, mumbling, "Humph, didn't even say hello." By the end of the day, Theo had moved most of his things inside. He waved again as he saw Frank watching, but Frank barely acknowledged him. The next morning, Theo was out early, sweeping his porch, and when Frank came out to pick up his newspaper, he couldn't resist a closer look. "Morning," Theo called, nodding again, hoping to strike up a conversation. "Beautiful neighborhood here. Glad to be moving in." Frank frowned. "Yeah, it was nice," he replied, barely looking at Theo as he went back inside. To Frank, Theo didn't belong in Hillcrest. But Frank didn't just leave it at that. A plan was forming in his mind. "I'll call the police," he thought, convinced that a strange man moving into town had to be trouble. Just to check things out. Without wasting a minute, Frank went inside, picked up his phone, and called the local police station, Hillcrest Department of Public Safety. He gave a dramatic description of a suspicious man hanging around the neighborhood, making sure to mention that he was big and acting strange. He even added that Theo might be dangerous. Within 10 minutes, Frank saw the familiar blue and red lights flashing as a patrol car pulled up. Two officers, Officer Hughes and Officer Lance, stepped out of the car, nodding at Frank before heading toward Theo's house. They were polite but stern, and Frank felt a small satisfaction bubbling up inside him. Finally, Frank thought, this stranger will know he's not welcome here. Theo was sweeping his porch when he noticed the patrol car pulling up in front of his house. He paused, his broom still in hand, and watched as the two officers approached him with calm but focused expressions. Officer Hughes, a seasoned cop with a gray mustache and a quiet demeanor, took the lead. "Good morning, sir," Officer Hughes greeted, eyeing Theo's porch and then looking back at him. "Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Theo put the broom aside and nodded politely. "Not at all, officer." "Is something wrong?" Just as Officer Hughes was about to respond, Frank stepped up to his own fence, watching the exchange from behind his white picket boundary. He crossed his arms, a smug look on his face. He wanted to make sure Theo knew he was behind the call. "Is this man causing any trouble, officers?" Frank called out, doing little to hide his satisfaction. Theo looked from the officers to Frank, eyebrows raised slightly. "Trouble?" he asked, confused. Officer Hughes turned toward Frank, offering a curt nod before addressing Theo again. "Sir, we received a call about some suspicious activity here." "Just routine." "Mind if we ask you for your identification?" Theo didn't hesitate. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed over his driver's license. The officers glanced at it, then exchanged a quick, knowing look. After a moment of silence, Officer Lance cleared his throat and gave a small nod to Theo. "Chief Brown, we didn't realize you'd be moving in today. Welcome to Hillcrest." Frank's face fell. His smug smile disappeared as the words sank in. "Chief Brown?" he muttered under his breath, eyes widening. He couldn't believe his ears. Theo smiled politely at the officers. "Thank you, gentlemen." I'm glad to be here. Hillcrest is a beautiful place, and I look forward to keeping it that way. He glanced at Frank, who was now frozen in place, looking as though he'd seen a ghost. The officers, still holding Theo's ID, turned to Frank with frowns on their faces. Officer Hughes spoke up, his voice carrying a hint of irritation. "Mr. Turner," he said, choosing his words carefully, "we came here expecting to deal with a serious issue. Chief Brown here is our new chief of police, and he's come to serve this community, not disrupt it." Frank's face went red, but he stammered on, trying to explain himself. I just didn't know. I thought he was. Well, he looked. Frank's voice trailed off, realizing he was only digging himself into a deeper hole. Theo watched him, an unreadable expression on his face. After a moment, he took a deep breath and spoke directly to Frank. "Mr. Turner," he said evenly, "I'm here because I believe in making Hillcrest a safe and fair place for everyone. I hope we can both agree on that." Frank swallowed hard, nodding quickly, still unable to believe that the very man he tried to report was now the head of Hillcrest's police force. Theo turned back to the officers, who handed his ID back to him. Officer Lance, with a small nod of respect, said, "Chief, we apologize for the inconvenience. Welcome again to the neighborhood. If you need anything, we're just a call away." Theo nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you, officers. I appreciate it." The two officers turned to leave, but not before giving Frank a hard look. Frank shuffled nervously, looking down at the ground as the patrol car pulled away. As the dust settled, he realized he was now alone with Theo, the man he had wrongly accused and insulted. Frank stood by his fence, not quite sure what to say. The realization that Theo was the new chief of police had rattled him, leaving him embarrassed and angry, though he wasn't sure who he was angrier at, himself or Theo. But here Theo stood, calm and composed, watching Frank without a hint of anger. Theo broke the silence first. "Look, Mr. Turner," he said, his voice measured. "I know moving into a new place, meeting new people, it's not always easy, and misunderstandings happen. I'd like us to start off on a better foot, if you're open to it." Frank looked away, feeling a mix of shame and confusion. He didn't know how to respond to Theo's offer of peace. He had expected Theo to be angry, maybe even threatening, but there was only calmness in his voice. "Well," Frank stammered, shuffling his feet, "I didn't realize. If I'd known you were—" His voice trailed off as he struggled to find the right words. Finally, he let out a sigh. "I made a mistake," he admitted, almost surprised at himself for saying it. Theo nodded, a hint of a smile on his face. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Turner. What matters is how we handle them afterward." Frank could feel his face burning. It wasn't easy for him to admit he was wrong, especially to someone like Theo, who had just moved in and hadn't even done anything wrong in the first place. But as he stood there, Frank began to realize that he didn't actually know Theo at all. All he knew was what he'd assumed. "Listen," Theo said after a moment. "I'm hosting a small get-together here this Saturday. It's just a little welcome gathering, nothing fancy. I'd love it if you and your wife could join us. You'll get to meet my family, and maybe we can get to know each other better." Frank blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected an invitation, especially after the trouble he'd caused. But something in Theo's voice made him feel both grateful and humbled. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. Well, I suppose that sounds nice. I'll check with my wife, but I think we could stop by." Theo smiled. "Great. See you then." The rest of the week, Frank couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He felt ashamed of how he judged Theo without knowing him. Maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong about more than just his neighbor. When Saturday came, Frank and his wife, Nancy, found themselves walking over to Theo's house. They carried a homemade pie, a Hillcrest welcome tradition that Nancy insisted on. Theo greeted them warmly, introducing them to his family and a few friends. There was laughter, the sound of children playing, and the smell of barbecue in the air. As the evening went on, Frank found himself relaxing, talking and laughing with Theo and his guests. Theo shared stories from his years on the force, the good and the hard, and Frank found himself listening, learning, and understanding. By the end of the night, as they said their goodbyes, Frank looked Theo in the eye. "Thank you for today," he said, his voice sincere. "I realize now I was wrong about a lot of things." Theo nodded, patting Frank's shoulder. "I appreciate you coming, Mr. Turner. And for what it's worth, I think you'll find Hillcrest is even better when we all look out for each other." Walking home that night, Frank felt lighter. He had come to realize that his neighborhood, his town, didn't just belong to people who looked like him. It belonged to everyone who cared about it, everyone who wanted to make it better. In the weeks that followed, Frank made an effort to get to know his neighbors, not just Theo but others he'd never really spoken to. Hillcrest didn't feel like it had changed, but Frank knew he had. And that, he decided, was a good thing. As for Theo, he continued serving as chief of police, committed to protecting the neighborhood he now called home. And every so often, he'd wave at Frank across the yard, a silent reminder of a lesson learned and a friendship that had once started with suspicion but had turned into something far better. This brings us to the end of this story. Thank you for watching till the end. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video and share it with your friends too. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more fascinating stories. Have a nice day.